My name is Jeff Follensby, and I serve as the Chief Executive Officer of the Chautauqua Foundation. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to this program under the aegis of the Lincoln Applied Ethics program at Chautauqua. And today it's with our good friend, Professor Jason Robert. The Lincoln series is a collaboration between Chautauqua and the David and Joan Lincoln family, and we've been doing this work for about 21 years now with funding from David and his family. And we're very grateful to them. You'll note throughout this week and throughout this summer, we've had a number of lecture programs that have been designated as part of the Lincoln series, and during the course of this summer, we've had professors from ASU here with us, both to lecture and lead master classes. We're very proud of this program and look forward to continuing to work on it with the Lincoln family, and I would ask you to join me in thanking them for their support. Jason is the director of the Lincoln Center for Applied Ethics and the Franca Orifice Dean's Distinguished Professor in the Life Sciences and Lincoln Associate Professor of Ethics and Biotechnology and Medicine at ASU. That's a lot of titles. His career encompasses teaching and researching the intersection of bioethics and philosophy of biology. And his most recent work focuses on what we should eat and why we don't. Professor Robert is indeed a Canadian and holds degrees from Queen's University at Kingston, Ontario, and McMaster University. Apparently, he didn't like cold weather and decided to make his career at Arizona. We work closely with Jason in the formulation of this program, and it's a great pleasure for me to welcome him to this podium, and I'm quite confident that you're in for a enjoyable but also educational experience. As you know, we are likely to be joined by various folks wandering in trying to claim a seat for the lecture that follows. I ask that you welcome them, make room as you can, and we'll try to keep order as best we can as we get closer to the 2 o'clock hour. But with that, I bring you Jason Robert.
Hi, everyone. Ah, lovely. It's totally unlike my classes where nobody ever says anything unless threatened. I hope you all had a chance to attend this morning's lecture by Dan Ariely from Duke University at the 10:45 slot. Part of the Lincoln Applied Ethics series this year, and also a pretty terrifically good introduction for some of the material that I'm going to be talking about today. I do want to emphasize that I didn't prepare an embarrassing story, but embarrassing stories sort of follow me everywhere. I'm going to tell you the least embarrassing one I can think of right now, which is that one of the things of which I am fearful is dinosaurs. So I'm going to start off picking up on some of the themes from Professor Ariely's presentation. In particular, one of the things that he pointed out that's absolutely critical for us to remember is that emotions are much quicker to bring us to action than cognitive processing or thinking about what to do actually is. This is a remarkable realization for philosophers, right? Philosophers who have spent the last 2,500 years trying to figure out how to rid our critical thinking from the influence of our emotions so that we can see the world plainly and objectively. Except that we don't, and we can't, and we probably shouldn't either. Now, I say that as a philosopher. I also say it as a bit of a self-loather, so take it with a grain of salt. But it does suggest that certain aspects of the philosophical project, especially with regard to thinking about ethics, have been misguided in the assumption that we can somehow or other do away with emotion in our effort to make do in the world, in our effort to do good in the world. So one of the ways I'm going to frame this is by telling you 4 quick stories about ways in which the work that I do has intersected with concerns about fear, and then try to tell a story, a sort of more comprehensive narrative, about the ways in which we ought potentially to think about fear as we think about how to improve the world in which we live. The first story is a perfectly straightforward one. It has to do with a student who came to see me about 12 years ago. She came to see me from a bioengineering lab, and she was a master's student, and she was asked to do a project in the lab, or assigned a project in the lab involving training rodents, in particular rats, to do various kinds of tasks, and then to record the neuronal activity in those rats as they were performing these tasks, and then to sacrifice the rats and subject their brain tissue and other aspects of their anatomy and physiology to further scrutiny. She was very fearful of rats, and in particular did not like handling them. And so all of a sudden, here she was, 22 years old, finished an undergraduate degree, funded to do a master's degree in a quite prestigious lab, with no capacity to figure out how she would be able to perform the work that had been assigned to her. I was able at the same time to relate quite dramatically, because when I was a little fatter kid, I went to summer camp, and my mom had bought me a new knapsack, and I woke up in the middle of the night to a mouse perched on the toes of my sleeping bag, eating his way or her way into the knapsack to get at the snacks that I had brought. And I screamed and panicked, and everybody woke up and came running, and then all the rest of the summer I was just the fat kid who brought food into the cabin. So I've also been fearful of rodents in that way. So I spoke with this student at some length about what her options were, what are the ways in which she could participate in the lab. She had been actually sent to me by her mentor, who wanted to talk through whether maybe it would be appropriate to do a project on some of the ethical issues associated with working with rats, because she said at the end of the day her fear in handling the rats was partially driven by a fear that she'd get scratched or bitten, but far more driven by a fear that maybe she shouldn't be treating animals in this way. And so as a result, we had a pretty productive conversation. She ended up finding a master's project in that lab that she was able to accomplish, and she's gone on to do a doctorate now. And it created for me an opportunity to reflect on the unique situation that I have at Arizona State University. So despite the liability of a PhD in philosophy, I am a professor of biology. And that is precisely the reason that I went to Arizona State University. It's not because of the weather. I moved in the summer, for instance. It was a long time ago. It was the summer of '04. It was 80 degrees with 90% humidity in Halifax, Nova Scotia. If there are any Nova Scotians here, happy civic holiday. And it was 113 with 11% humidity in Arizona. But that said, that's really comfortable compared to the humidity in Halifax. So I was thrilled. But I didn't go because I was hoping to experience a different climate, at least not in terms of weather. I was hoping to experience a different climate in terms of the intellectual space in which I'd be able to work. And the fact that I was a philosopher in the biology department made it much easier for colleagues like my friend Steve to find me, to be able to send students to me, and to use that as the basis now for a decade-long collaboration that has manifested in a really nice and very interesting project funded by the Department of Defense right now. I'm not going to talk about that today. Not because I can't, just because I'm afraid to. But one of the aspects of our collaboration that was really fun was that we tried to figure out how we could get my students into his lab and his students into my lab, which is really just a really nice boardroom, basically, where we can sit around and talk and collaborate. And it was evident to us that his lab was a perfect place for this. He really cared about the ethical issues, and though he did a little bit of work with non-human animals in terms of rodents, the bulk of his work was with primates. And really what he does is he drills holes in monkey skulls and then figures things out on the basis of that. Not the happiest kind of laboratory practice, although undertaken exceptionally well on a very small number of very well cared for animals in his particular lab. But here was a scientist who was already committed to doing the right thing, and so he was an easy target for me, even though he was the one who found me. The challenge that we had was when we tried to find other labs who would be willing to collaborate with us. And while it was possible to find robotics labs and labs that did some work on, say, Parkinson's disease or other kinds of conditions that were associated with humans, we had an impossible time getting into rodent labs. And one of the reasons, it turns out, is that the scientists were fearful that the ethicists would get in the way of the work. And there are all kinds of reasons for that, right? Typically involving the kinds of protests that we've seen organized by animal welfare and animal liberation activists. And sometimes those protests can take a very violent, deep and dark turn. But that was never the ambition for us. And in fact, I'd spent 8 months in Steve's lab doing some participant observation work with the monkeys, and then also with the students. I should clarify that I mean different things there. In monkey labs, they make all these outrageously inappropriate jokes, and so I feel the need to be careful. So with this wonderful group of students and wonderful group of non-human primate subjects, I spent a lot of time. I knew what the nitty-gritty was like. I was there, was holding the hand of one of the rhesus. This was a vervet as we put the monkey down, and it's the kind of thing that should not have created any fear on the part of any other scientist at ASU. If the ethicist is going to do that, the ethicist is sure as heck not going to cause a whole bunch of dismay over rodents, especially mice, who are getting the crap kicked out of them in a psych lab, right? I mean, that for me would be exciting to watch rather than something I'd try to get in the way of. But there was a lot of fear because there's a concern that when ethicists enter the picture, they are there to stop the work. Now, sometimes that's an appropriate thing to do, but if the work's worth doing, then it's worth justifying doing well, and if it can be justified doing well, then the ethicists are going to be playing along rather than standing in the way. And so that's the work that I've been doing there. But it's very interesting for me how fear played that role. A second story I'm going to tell you takes us back even further than 2006, to 200 years ago this very summer. Does anybody know what was happening, what happened in Lake Geneva, late June, early July, 1818? No, I know you weren't there or anything, but that was when Mary Shelley accepted the dare issued by her lover, Percy Shelley, and Lord Byron, and others who were in attendance, to write a scary ghost story. And that scary ghost story became Frankenstein. I'm sorry, I said 1818, I meant 1817. It was published in 1818, January 1, 1818, and so we're now currently experiencing a whole lot of Frankensteinia in terms of the 200th anniversary of the publication of that book. Now, Frankenstein is a book that has been, I think, prescribed to students to read. Students have been expected to read Frankenstein more so than just about any other novel in the English language. It's not clear that they've actually read it. A lot of people get their Frankenstein stories from the movies, and in particular Young Frankenstein, which is a little bit different from Mary Shelley's original formulation. But Frankenstein is a remarkable story. It's not always beautifully well written. Mary Shelley was 17 when she was writing it, so bear that in mind. And she was not a polished author in the way that her mentors and lover were, but nonetheless, she came from a very smart, prolific family intellectually, and she had done some serious thinking about what would constitute an appropriate ghost story to win the dare, as it were. Now, if you have read Frankenstein, awesome. If you haven't, I highly recommend buying the edition that I just co-edited. And I want you to buy it from Amazon and not from the MIT Press, because you'll get it for $13 instead of $20. But still, it's a very cheap book compared to others. You can also just get somebody else's Frankenstein for 45 cents. But what makes ours different is that we've got half a dozen essays in there from very creative, famous scholars and science fiction writers dealing with aspects of the book. And it's specifically designed to be of interest to scientists and engineers. And we call it an edition for scientists, engineers, and creators of all kinds. And one of the key essays in that book that we compiled alongside the original 1818 text is a story about basically parenting and what went wrong in the Frankenstein story. Now, those of you who know the book know that Frankenstein was the doctor, not the monster, or the creature, as we call him throughout our book. And what he referred to, what Dr. Frankenstein referred to as he went about on this task as a kind of an outsider, an autodidact. He was reading a whole bunch of stuff that nobody else was reading in the sciences. He was reading stuff that people thought had been totally discredited, but he was also keeping up on the current science of the time. Well, in the novel, Mary Shelley has the doctor saying this: "No one can conceive the variety of feelings which bore me onwards like a hurricane in the first enthusiasm of success. Life and death appeared to me ideal bounds, which I should first break through and pour a torrent of light into our dark world. A new species would bless me as its creator and source. Many happy and excellent natures would owe their being to me. No father could claim the gratitude of his child so completely as I should deserve theirs. Pursuing these reflections, I thought that if I could bestow animation upon lifeless matter, I might in process of time, although I now found it impossible, to renew life where death had apparently devoted the body to corruption." And so this is as he's describing the work that he's doing in the effort to create the creature. And he makes the creature very big, as some of you may recall from the story. And the rationale for making the creature so big was in order to make it a little bit easier to work with the parts. Right? If it's a bigger creature, then you don't have to worry so much about precision. Of course, that's what we would call a trade-off, especially if it turns out that the creature, poorly parented, turns out to be maniacal and massive, and therefore very difficult to control. Now, I want to read you the moment from the novel at which point the good doctor, or not so much, awakens his creation. He says, "It was on a dreary night of November that I beheld the accomplishment of my toils. With an anxiety that almost amounted to agony, I collected the instruments of life around me that I might infuse a spark of being into the lifeless thing that lay at my feet. It was already 1 a.m. The rain pattered dismally against the panes, and my candle was nearly burnt out when, by the glimmer of the half-extinguished light, I saw the dull yellow eye of the creature open. It breathed hard, and a convulsive motion agitated its limbs. How can I describe my emotions at this catastrophe? Or how delineate the wretch whom with such infinite pains and care I had endeavored to form?" It's a remarkable statement to be made literally the minute that he awakens his creation. He refers to it not as a triumph, as he had just days and weeks and months earlier, but rather as a catastrophe, a wretch, demonstrating a deep-seated fear of what he had wrought in the world. Now, the Frankenstein story is a remarkable one, and as I say, well worth reading if you haven't. And in particular, one of the things that many of us have grappled with is just how it came to be that the doctor went from sort of champion of this new creative power to terrified child in the face of this monstrous creation. And as a result of that reaction really of fear and loathing and disgust, Dr. Frankenstein abandons the creature, and the creature then ends up having to raise himself or herself, not quite a latchkey kid, but kind of, and with, as you may know, some pretty terrible consequences. So I think the idea of thinking of Frankenstein as a parenting story is a really interesting one. It certainly does bring out the kind of fear that many people have as they embark on the quest to have children, as many of you have done or have children who are currently doing. And to me, this is especially interesting given where we are right now in the contemporary world of biotechnological advancement, if you want to call it that. Some of you will have seen a very recent publication stipulating the successful alteration of the genome of human embryos using the CRISPR-Cas9 technology at Oregon Health and Science University. For some folks, this is exactly the kind of thing that's as exciting as Dr. Frankenstein's work early on before he created the monster. For others, it's all about the monster and the monsters who are creating ever more monsters. I'm not going to take a stance on this today except to suggest that if parenting or the prospect of becoming a parent weren't already a terrifying prospect for people, imagine just what we can expect in the near future as we see ever more intrusion into the capacity to create human life and, for that matter, to alter it at its very basic level. The third story I'm going to tell you is a sideline to this, and it has to do with part of the early work that I did when I first became a faculty member in the year 2000. So in 1998, some of you will remember that Dolly the sheep had been cloned. And just the year before, there had been in 97, just the year after, scientists at Wisconsin and at another university on the East Coast demonstrated that they could isolate pluripotent stem cells from humans. And in the one case, it was from a human embryo, and the other case, it was from a human fetus. And these pluripotential stem cells are cells that have the capacity, under the right conditions, cultured appropriately, or if you like, parented appropriately, they have the capacity to become any cell in the human body. And if they can become any cell, then again, under the right conditions, they can become any organ or tissue. Now, the fact that this happened around the same time as cloning took place, and the fact that there was some thought that maybe cloning would be the best strategy to be able to access human embryos for this job, meant that the imagination, the public imagination, was running wild with speculation about what the future might hold. On the one hand, there were folks who were desperately excited by this prospect. If we can create cells in the lab that we can then transfer into the bodies of patients suffering from disorders like juvenile diabetes or Parkinson's disease, so at either end of the lifespan, you can imagine the excitement that this technological breakthrough might allow for the treatment of these conditions with human tissue that could potentially produce the appropriate endocrinological reactions in patients with juvenile diabetes, and the potentially also repopulate the brain of dopamine-producing neurons in those diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. But more people got really excited by the idea that we're on the verge of creating absolute freaking monsters in the lab. And in fact, that scientists are doing just that, and they're doing it with public funds, and they're doing it without any oversight, and we need to stop them now. And that fearful reaction was the one, I think, that took hold. You might recall that there were a number of bills that were attempted to be passed in legislatures around the country, including one that would have effectively have banned twins, because it would have banned the creation of genetically identical individuals, but identical twins, are genetically identical individuals. So there was some very quick reaction based on the emotional reaction that people had, and that generated the possibility of some legal instruments that would have been very difficult to overturn. Now, the response from every scientist I talk to and most of the ethicists I talk to is, oh, no, don't worry, you just need to talk to these people, teach them what they need to know about stem cells, about cloning, and the more they know, the more they'll accept it. With two caveats, of course. One of them is that you just heard for an hour from Dan Ariely that you can talk to people all you like, but once emotion takes over, cognitive processing is going to be severely weakened. So you're not going to talk people out of their deep-seated emotional reactions. That isn't to say you can't dissuade them or deter them. You're just not going to do it through conversation or education, which are the two things that most scientists and ethicists were hoping for at the time. The second reason is that it turns out that the more you know, the more likely you are to be skeptical of the grandiose claims that we're going to be able to do everything under the sun with these magic little bullets that people call stem cells. And in fact, here we are 20 years later, and still very slowly but surely making progress toward some small incremental improvements in quality of life for people afflicted with a wide range of conditions. So we've got a situation where fear drove people to try to stop certain kinds of the science that was taking place. You also had scientists reacting very fearfully. And in fact, in California, when they passed the ballot measure to support stem cell research in 2004, that measure included a constitutional amendment giving scientists the right to conduct stem cell research, because they feared that regular people would get in the way of the research actually moving forward appropriately or at all. And so fear can drive us in a variety of different directions here. And Dan Ariely made a really good point up front, which is that fear has been almost exclusively a useful emotion historically in our species, as in every other. Fear helps us survive. But if what we're fearful of is not worth fearing because it doesn't threaten our existence, then maybe we've got a different situation on our hands. Now, the stem cell stuff was just the tip of the iceberg, right? Very shortly after that, there was a push that had been underway for many years, but became more public, to create a human neuron mouse. So a mouse with human neurons in its brain. The idea being that a mouse with human neurons in its brain would be a better animal on which to experiment with different kinds of therapeutics than a mouse with mouse cells in its brain. Because let's face it, we're not trying to cure mouse brain disorders. We're trying to cure human brain disorders. So the human neuron mouse came out. Well, talk about it. The work was never done. There was also the creation of hybrid embryos. And so the idea here is instead of having to worry about getting eggs from, say, a female human donor, and that's not an easy process, and there are all kinds of issues associated with it that have been identified over the years. Instead of having to have access to human eggs, what if you could take eggs from an animal that's easier to convince, like maybe an animal that's been heavily domesticated in the agricultural domain, for instance, a cow or a pig. What if we could get cow or pig or bunny eggs, and then using the technology that was involved in cloning, remove the nuclear DNA, the nucleus, from those eggs, and then fuse those enucleated eggs with human DNA, human nuclear DNA, to yield an egg that is, or an embryo rather, that's fertilized chemically, sort of like what Dr. Frankenstein was up to back in the day, or electrically. And what you end up with is this little embryo that develops for a small number of days, at which point it develops about 99.9% human DNA, but still has the mitochondrial DNA of the non-human animal. And since it's not human, right, since it came from a cow egg, we don't have to worry about killing it. Of course, it's 99.9% human. That's the whole point of doing it. And this got people very concerned about where the line between human and non-human actually lies. And when you consider the history of this country in particular, in terms of just how little blood it required to be deemed somehow non-deserving of the same rights as everybody else, you can see why there might be some concern about these hybrids. But on a lighter note, sometimes people would just joke around. The human neuron mouse was just like Mickey Mouse come to life. The hybrids were just like cowboys, literally cowboys, and so forth. Took a really interesting turn. All of this is happening sort of contemporaneously, the turn of the millennium, with a quest for a patent on the technique that would be useful to create a part human, part chimpanzee creature called the human Z. Now, the human Z patent quest was quite fascinating. It was undertaken by a developmental biologist, a very far left-leaning liberal, who was very concerned that we were somehow or other absolutely objectifying and, if you like, almost desacralizing human life in pursuit of fame or fortune. And so what he desperately wanted was a patent from the US Patent and Trademark Office so that he could put that patent in a drawer, not license the technology to anybody, and therefore help us avoid having humanzees running about amongst us. Now, Stuart Newman is his name. He's a professor of developmental biology at Valhalla Medical College here in New York State. Eventually was unsuccessful in the patent quest after a number of efforts over a period of 4 or 5 years. And the patent commissioner ended up saying that they would not patent a technology that embraces a human being. That language, it embraces a human being. That's not very technical language, very difficult to ascertain what that means, but it did lead to no patent on the human Z. Now, the retired patent commissioner said the real reason the patent office didn't issue the patent was because patents are not designed to be put in drawers so people can keep others from developing them. Patents are designed to enhance innovation. And so they wanted to see this, if it was going to be worthwhile doing, they wanted to see it licensed. And Newman wasn't going to do that. And so that left open the door for somebody else to come along to go ahead and try to patent a technology for creating a human Z. Nobody's done that. It's not in the cards. But nonetheless, it generated some significant fear. Here, one of the roles of fear was on the part of the former patent commissioner, who was concerned that any effort to stop scientific progress threatens to plunge us into darkness. That's a pretty strong claim. Any effort to curtail in any way scientific progress plunges us into darkness. Well, that seems to be a license on doing whatever the heck you want, as long as you can justify it in terms of maybe a life will get saved. And that's not a very good situation to be in, and you don't have to visit Nazi Germany to know why. So, a ton of fear about these creatures as well. A little titillation, a lot of fear, a lot of disgust. And one of the things that came out was a very strong sense that, at least amongst conservative opponents of these technologies, disgust was the appropriate emotional response. We should be disgusted with these creatures. We should be disgusted with the creatures who are creating these creatures. We should be doing something different. We should be rethinking the meaning of life. We should be reinvesting the human body and spirit with some kind of sacred significance. We should be doing something like that. And the most famous proponent of that view was the guy who ran the president's bioethics commission underneath well, I guess not underneath, under George W. Bush. His name's Leon Cass. And Cass, professor at University of Chicago, longtime very conservative critic of advances in biomedicine, well-trained in the sciences himself, derived a phrase, or coined a phrase, the wisdom of repugnance. And the wisdom of repugnance, the idea is, if something makes you feel total disgust, then maybe it should. That is, maybe there's something about that thing that really does or should produce that sense of disgust. Now, an evolutionary biologist would take you back and talk about, for instance, the ways in which biting into rancid food immediately generates a sense of disgust, right? You bite into something that's really bad, what do? You don't, I mean, typically what you do is you actually say, does this taste bad to me? And hand it off to your friend. But that's because of our sort of more narcissistic contemporary society. I mean, I think historically what our ancestors would do is spit it out, retch, and avoid it, and make sure others avoided it as well. Disgust was a wise response to rancid food. The question was, is disgust a wise response to what others are deeming progress in biomedical research? A lot of ethicists got really upset about this because they were concerned, as we started off the story today, that disgust is an emotion and ethics is about reasons. So unless you can give us reasons for holding something to be morally controversial, then we're not going to listen to you. And that did a terrible thing in this country. In particular, what it did is it disenfranchised just about everyone whose views about moral life in any way involve religious faith. Because typically in religious faith, you're not going to be giving a purely rational accounting. There are plenty of reasons, but you're not going to be giving a rational accounting. You're going to be giving an accounting that involves reasons as well as emotions or values, faith. And by disenfranchising sort of faith-based interaction in thinking through the ethical dimensions of the work that we do, I think we ended up with a much more libertarian kind of approach. And while on the one hand that might be entirely appropriate, on the other hand it might not be. But we never got a chance to question which way we ought to go forward. Fear drove us one way, and the response to fear drove us exactly the other. Now, the last story I want to tell you before I move into the main sort of summary points is it's become increasingly clear that teaching ethics fails miserably if the goal is to teach people to behave ethically. All of the evidence to date shows no matter how you learn ethics, typically what you end up with when you walk out of an ethics classroom is a better sense of how to justify the bad behavior you were going to engage in before you ever took the ethics class in the first place. You're just a more sophisticated justifier of the biases and the intuitions and whatever values you had upon going into the class. Now that's a little cynical, right? A little cynical. But it has to do very much with the fact that what drives people to action is not reason, but emotion. And if we leave emotion out of the ethics classroom, as philosophers have done for centuries, then we end up in a rather precarious position when it comes to trying to figure out what next. So teaching ethics generally fails, and that's been a little bit soul-destroying for me as somebody who teaches ethics for a living, but it's forced me to really rethink what it is we ought to be doing and how we ought to be thinking about this stuff. So I'm not going to take much more time. I just have a couple of summary points I want to make that tie this together for you so that we have time for some questions. One of the really interesting historical dimensions of this issue is the issue being fear and the nature of fear and the role of fear in our world is that, at least historically, it has been the source of an automatic physiological response. the fight or flight response, right? When faced with an alert that something is threatening, that something is worth fearing, we have the body put on alert by the autonomic nervous system. We have the adrenal cortex secreting very high levels of stress hormones of various sorts. We have an increase in heartbeat and an increase in the intensity of the heartbeat. Breathing also intensifies and becomes more rapid. The thyroid gland stimulates all kinds of metabolic responses. Our larger muscles are oxygenated preferentially, and we are ready either to jump into battle or get the hell out of Dodge, right? Those are your two options. Now, again, evolutionarily, that's pretty good. That's a great strategy, right? You want to have these things happening automatically. You want to have, in the face, for instance, of a predator or a serious, potentially serious, evident threat, you want to have your body responding in a way that prepares you either to leave, and so to avoid the harm, or die trying to make sure the harm doesn't get the better of you. Now, the fight response is a kind of engaging aggressively response, right? You jump into action and mobilize against the threat. The flight response is more of a kind of passive retreat. I mean, it still might be quite active depending on how fast you run, but retreat is going to be a more passive kind of engagement. And these are built upon layer of evolutionary scaffolding and developmental learning that could help us to discern when we've got a real threat on our hands versus a false threat. And these layers of scaffolding and learning can help us mediate our behavioral responses, cognitively sometimes, but also emotionally in all kinds of very useful ways. But I think that this evolutionary scaffolding and this developmental and social learning actually does a really good job of enhancing for us in the contemporary world the variety of available responses. Fighting and fleeing are not the only means at our disposal. There are other things we might do in the face of threat. And while fear can be a very important guide for us morally, and it can be a very important tool for our moral development, we're not actually going to get there if all we're prepared to do is flee or fight. If all we're prepared to do is beat up our opponent or avoid him or her altogether. So what we need to do is find those alternative strategies. Now, turns out that the brain region that's most involved in feeling afraid and anxious, which is the amygdala, is also most involved in generating aggression. And when you've got the case, for instance, of post-traumatic stress disorder, you've got a case of an overreactive response to mildly fearful stimuli. That is, for anybody else, the stimulus is just going to be an irritation, whereas for somebody suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, the stimulus can be dramatically life-altering. And that's a really important situation where we need to have to figure out how we can generate the appropriate kinds of response to the objective level of the fearfulness of a stimulus. But it turns out that that's not so easy. And the strategies that we can use, for instance, with PTSD, one possibility that's been talked about for years is effectively drugging soldiers before they go into particular battles so that they lack the capacity for memory consolidation, long-term memory consolidation, so that they walk out of the battle unharmed, quote unquote, unharmed psychologically, because they haven't actually remembered what's happened. But the flip side of that, of course, as some of you can, I know you know because I see the way your heads are turning, the flip side of that is then we have soldiers going into battle without any empathy, without any capacity actually to follow the rules of war, without potentially any capacity to feel badly, even for mistakes that get made. And let's face it, mistakes get made in that arena as they do in every arena all the time. On top of that, our anxiety responses can be manipulated in all kinds of ways, sometimes for good, sometimes less so. Cognitive behavioral therapy, probably for good. Marketing, maybe. My sister is in marketing, so I don't want to be too cruel there. And one of the things that's become crystal clear is that because we can have our emotional responses, including our anxiety, readily manipulated, and because those responses are powerful and guide action more so than reason, we can have a very deeply ingrained set of almost automatic responses to stimuli, to encounters, to experiences, to situations that are very hard to shake. And just being aware of the existence of the cognitive bias or the emotional bias is not actually going to take you very far. So some of you may be aware of some really interesting work that's been done focused on differences between perceptions of men and women, and perceptions of ugly people and pretty people, and perceptions of white people and black people, for instance, in America. And these perceptions are typically very, very simple exposures. You might be exposed to a series of pictures, one after the next. And you might be asked to say, every time you see a human being, you're asked, if you see a human being or happy together, or separately, you're supposed to press one button. And if you see a troll or, misery, then you press another button. But the more that you, and people are pretty good at this, right? But the more that you mix it up and put the troll next to happy and the person next to misery, unless it's an ex-spouse or something, the more messed up people's judgments are going to become. The more it's actually possible to bias their judgments through priming. A really nice example of this is where, and this has to do with a sort of implicit race bias that's plainly evident in this country, and that's been well described. But there's a study in which subjects were asked to identify a salient object in a fragmented picture. So you had to figure out what was going on in the picture, but you didn't really have many clues. If you were subliminally primed, so fraction of a second, hardly any time to recognize it consciously, with a white face versus a black face, before you looked at these images, your reactions would vary dramatically or differ dramatically. And in particular, one of the key findings was, if you show a series of white Americans, a series of these photographs with the tiniest amount of priming, with a black face, the face of a black person, before you show the pictures, those subjects are far more likely to pick out weapons in the fragmented pictures than, say, cameras or books or eyeglasses. And that's because of this very subtle association that the priming does. And face detection and race detection and bias has been very, very well studied for a long time. Elizabeth Phelps in particular at NYU is tremendous on this stuff. But some of the findings that have come out are that white Americans remember white faces far more readily than black faces. If you show a video of someone whose hand is being poked with a needle, the subject, that is the person who's looking at the video of somebody's hand being poked with a needle, has what's called an isomorphic sensory motor response. That is, they're going to maybe clench their own hand in sympathy. But it turns out for both whites and blacks, if the hand that you see in the video So if you're a black person and the hand you see in the video is a white hand, your response is blunted a little bit. Similar to if you're a white person and you see a black hand versus a white hand being poked, your emotional reaction is blunted a little bit. And if you also happen to be a racist, it's going to be blunted a heck of a lot. So the idea behind these biases is not that they are themselves racist, that's a different conversation, but they are present and they can lead, especially in a world in which we can go very easily into a variety of ways to manipulate and prime certain kinds of emotional responses, we can end up with the ability to foment tremendous hatred or, compassion really, really easily. And insofar as the emotion is what drives us, even when we know better, as long as the emotion drives us, we end up in a pretty bad place. One of my favorite findings of all these days is that in a court of law, a black defendant who wears sort of big, chunky glasses, I meant to wear mine today, but a black defendant who wears that kind of attire, those glasses, is going to have a far more sympathetic reaction from the jury than a black person with nothing on his eyes. And this is, don't forget, justice is blind and all that good stuff, although if you read the new Jim Crow, you might think otherwise. You're going to be, there's something, I don't know if I want to say horrifying, but there's something worrisome about that state of affairs, where we know this is an issue. So defense attorneys are always encouraging their black defendants to wear nerd glasses, and prosecutors are now very often questioning the legitimacy of those glasses if they're there as jewelry rather than as needed for prescription. It's a remarkable situation. And this is not because you've got 12 ugly racists in the jury. It's way more subtle, way more deeply ingrained, and way more difficult to change than that. So I want to say just a couple of last words before I turn it over to you for questions. If we've got other responses beyond fighting and fleeing, what might those responses be? Well, one of them that I'm kind of keen on is facing reality. Now, you're not going to face reality by reading a book or listening to a lecture, although those things typically don't hurt, but they can, depending on the book or the lecturer. But by actually engaging in the world, really having a sense based on experience, based on curiosity, based on imagination, of what you're actually up against when something makes you fearful, when something gives you pause. It's not going to help us with the implicit biases, but it's going to help us with more explicit ones. And sometimes the explicit biases can actually be useful as a guide to figuring out what might be done with the implicit biases. Now, facing reality, especially where you're fearful, so like me going to the Museum of Natural History in New York after I told you about the dinosaurs, or me buying mice to feed to a snake. I mean, the mice were dead and they were going to get fed to a snake. But still, these are what some folks might call limit experiences. These are the kinds of experiences we can give ourselves to help us overcome a certain kind of fear, or at least grapple with it in a way that's more appropriate. That grappling is not going to be a cognitive processing of it. It's going to be an emotional interaction with it. But that emotional interaction is really important. So one of the things we really do need to worry about, I don't know if you've noticed, I talked about anxiety first, so fear and anxiety. Then I talked about fear and bias, so A, B. I bet you know what's coming next. Oh, I was going to go with O for blood types. No, C. Conviviality, which is what I'm most interested in the world, basically how to live well together. And it turns out that us, theming, categorizing the world in terms of us and them, is absolutely critical to pro-social development of moral communities. Without using and theming, we're not going to be able to to be together as part of a community. Without us-theming, moral communities struggle quite dramatically. Some really nice work on this recently summarized by Robert Sapolsky in his book, Behave. It's about that big, 800 pages, a perfect beach read for the summer. Now, this idea that us-theming is crucial to pro-social moral community building might seem like an oxymoron, but I don't think it is, because the key in prosociality is how we treat each other, not how we treat them. So it's not necessarily us-theming as a useful tool is not about exclusion so much as it is about inclusion. You can't be inclusive all the time of everybody without running dramatic risks, but you can be much more inclusive than exclusive. And as Dan Ariely told us this morning, don't forget that trust is a social lubricant that goes a very, very long way, and it reduces opportunity costs and transaction costs quite dramatically. Now, if I were to go into D, we'd talk more about disgust, and then I forget what E would be about, probably envy or something. But I'm not going to do that. This isn't an alphabet lesson. What I really just want to underscore at the end of the day is a lesson that's being learned now increasingly from behavioral economics and psychology as a contribution to moral philosophy. And it's the idea that when ethicists condemn a moral response for it being too emotional, that dramatically overrates dramatically overrates rationality. Irrationality may be, in fact, way more relevant. Jonathan Haidt at NYU has been doing some really nice work in this space. He has a metaphor of the elephant and the rider. I don't know if you're familiar with this metaphor, but I'm going to wrap up with it. We are elephants before we are riders. The elephant is the metaphor here. The elephant is the emotional content of our brains and of the stimuli around us. The rider is the cognitive stuff. Remember what Dan Ariely said about our brains. Our brains are dramatically evolved over time, but based on, if you like, the inner brain that is quite ancient, that is evolutionarily ancient. So we are elephants before we are riders. We react emotionally before we react cognitively. And think of the idea of an elephant rider. How often do you think the rider is in control? So the elephants do all the heavy lifting, and the idea of a rider controlling the elephant or keeping it in check is a kind of rationalist fantasy that's prevented us from trying to figure out how to face reality head on, especially with regard to some of our more contemporary situations in which we're faced with fearful stimuli. I don't mean the gunman at the door. I mean the chimera in the lab in the UK, or some of the other advances in, say, biotechnology that have generated such significant fear responses. So if you can't train a rider, and that's all we do in philosophy classes, right? We train riders. If you can't train a rider to control an elephant, then what hope do you have? Well, it turns out that there are all kinds of cultural or community mechanisms and strategies that can help us to guide elephants, and that's not going to be because we're taking the reins. However, collectively, 100 riders is not really going to help either, don't forget. But rather by facilitating some options rather than others. And so if you can say, for instance, change the terrain, you can change the game, right? If the elephant can't go down a particular path, you don't need to steer it away from that path. It'll go down the path that's actually available to it. So if we work on building social and community structures that make doing the right thing easier rather than harder, whether that right thing is understood emotionally, rationally, or ideally both, we're going to be able to have much better outcomes in our communities as we move forward. Fear can do some good work for us. It doesn't just help us survive, but too much fear can freeze us. Too much fear can lead to cowardice, and too much fear can be, in fact, the first steps toward the closing of our societies and the breakdown of our civilization. Thanks. So we figure we've got up to 10 minutes for questions, this side and this side, as we have to make room for the 2 p.m. lecture. But please go ahead.
Hi. I've been coming here for almost 20 years, and in all that time, I have never felt the need to get up to this microphone. But I have to tell you that when you talked about us versus them, creating a moral community, when I look at how this country is divided, and I look at how we're demonizing each other, and I look at what's happened with healthcare in this country versus countries that are more homogeneous, where we take care of all of us, but now we say to ourselves, well, I want healthcare, but I don't want, or I want Medicaid, I don't want them to get it, and then it turns out that the big safety net is much more red state than anything else, but we're systematically, some of us, feeding the fearful people with a whole story, oh, you have to be fearful of them, the immigrants, the people who don't look like us. So that's why I react viscerally when you say that us versus them creates a moral community.
So let me stipulate, I'm not actually making a moral claim when I say that. I'm making a factual claim. Historically, that's how moral communities are built. Now the question is, just because they're moral communities, that doesn't mean that they are better than other moral communities. But I think the point I want to make is something like this. Not all thems are the same. There are some thems that make very good sense and can be the core of appropriate kinds of boundaries. But really what I was trying to emphasize more importantly was that it's about how we treat us and how we expand the circle of us rather than about how we treat them. Now, don't forget, I'm Canadian. We don't have a homogeneous society in Canada. We have a pretty diverse society in Canada, and we refer to it as a mosaic rather than a melting pot because we don't force everybody to be the same. And yet we do a better job there of actually accounting for everybody. So I think that's a really important consideration. There you have using and theming that's actually, that can actually be conducive to better social policy. At the same time, I say that in Arizona, I get threats to be hanged, right? So I really appreciate the visceral response because I think it's the right one to have. Us and them or othering, this kind of thing, is almost always, we can almost always come up with examples of that being detrimental. At the same time, it can also be very useful. What we need to do is be more expansive in our definition of us and less expansive in our definition of them.
I guess the question is how we stop demonizing here and how maybe we learn from you folks.
So using and theming is not the same as demonizing the other. So I think that's a critical point.
But that's what seems to have happened.
Yeah, we're in a predicament right now. It's true. Hi.
Hi, thank you very much for your interesting lecture. I came in a little bit late, and you might have covered this, but in the responses to fearful situations, the fight or flight, there's also freeze. And I experienced that in at least 3 very traumatic situations in my life. I don't know if you've already elaborated.
I didn't.
It's a strong, very much a response in war, in danger. I experienced it and came out of it. I'm not sure when or how, but I became alive again because I went dead, blank. I was gone.
So thanks very much for bringing that up. I think it's an important consideration, right? So some people refer to the freeze response as just the kind of flight response or kind of a poorly executed flight response where you're mobilized for action either to race away or engage, and somehow or other your body fails you and you end up with your muscles actually spasming, and your muscles and your psyche and everything spasming rather than enabling any kind of action. That's certainly another kind of response that's out there. For what it's worth, I think it's the one that we very often readily adopt when we're faced with moral conflict, because a lot of us don't like to fight. At least on Facebook, I don't, for instance. Bar fights, sure, but on Facebook, I'm not going to do that. Similarly, I'm also not likely to flee, but I am likely just to wonder. I'm actually just to stop and pause and wonder and worry, and that's not very helpful either, and it can actually breed a kind of apathy that makes it harder to engage either by fleeing or fighting or more happily facing reality. Oh.
You mentioned Sapolsky's book, Behave, and in that he quotes Damasio, who wrote a book called Descartes' Error. And it seems that the earlier lecture and your lecture today seems to bifurcate cognitive versus emotional, whereas Damasio clearly showed that good cognitive decisions always contain an emotional component.
Yeah, so I think that's actually a really nice observation as well. So I certainly don't mean to bifurcate that. Philosophers historically have done that, and this is the reason why Damasio refers to his book, why it's called Descartes' Error, right? The Cartesian philosophical view that sees the body and mind as separate entities that interact via the pineal gland is a view that was mistaken then, and it's been proven to be mistaken through advances in neuroscience, in particular in psychology, over the last 100 years or so. But I think what I really want to get at in emphasizing the emotional dimensions of this, especially when we're talking about fear as an emotion, is that just because something is emotional doesn't mean that it's necessarily irrational, and just because something is rational doesn't mean that it's necessarily free of emotion. In fact, we're always going to need both in one form or another. Now, the whole field of behavioral economics has started to show us that very often we have heuristics that can do us good. So Kahneman's thinking fast and slow is a really good example of that, and shows us which kinds of heuristics can help us make good decisions quickly, like whether to fight or flee or face our fear. But at the same time, there are also going to be opportunities that are not going to be so easily describable. But there's no bifurcation in my mind.
This might be, I might be maybe guilty of trying to link your lecture today with the one intended for next week. But I'm wondering where addiction, and I mean that broadly, fits into all of this, from addiction to my constant habit pattern of checking for an ESPN or what Trump did last minute or whatever, that I can't seem to stop, that I just go to over and over. So between thinking or emotion versus rationality and responses to fear, fight, flight, etc., how does addiction fit into all of this?
Complexly. I mean, to be honest, I couldn't give you a better answer than that, but I recommend Sapolsky's book, Behave, and I'll give you my card and send you a couple of resources on things that I've been thinking about. For what it's worth, in 2 weeks when I talk about what we should eat and why we don't, I will be grappling with some of that material there, but it's hard to do it right this second. Thanks, though. Last question.
So as we confront the present reality as an ethicist, how do you handle the manipulation of the fear response? Because today it seems that politics is very preoccupied with manipulating fear.
Yeah, so I meant to have a caveat at the beginning that I was going to talk about things like biology and biotechnology and leave politics for people who are either registered to vote in this country or who spend their time worrying about the political system with an appropriate intellectual eye. I'm not that person, but this manipulation of fear or fear response is absolutely critical no matter what domain we're in, and it's one that I need to think about more. At this point in time, I do feel a little bit frozen at times, and I worry about that because if it is the case that you can't engage emotionally with an opponent or somebody who disagrees with you, and you can't engage factually or cognitively with that person, then what are you left to do in order to be able to move forward? And at that point in time, another F might make sense, forgiveness, but I'm not entirely sure that that's warranted. Do we have time for one more, or are we done? If it's quick, we have one more.
Yes, thank you very much. We're in the Hall of Philosophy, so we've thought intellectually about emotions. Can we train emotions to be, train our behavior and the emotional responses the way we've trained our cognitive thinking?
So the answer is yes, we can train our emotional responses. We're not going to train it in the same way that we train our cognitive responses. Different mechanisms are necessary. But for instance, one of the things that's come crystal clear in looking at what works in teaching moral character development, especially in K through 12 settings, it turns out almost exclusively games of various sorts are going to be able to do the trick to help underscore the value of cooperation. For instance, the sort of mini versions of the prisoner's dilemma that we heard about this morning, where cooperation is better than defection. And so games like that, or the Public's Good game, are games that can help people understand emotionally without necessarily understanding cognitively, and therefore their emotional intelligence is sufficient to help guide better behaviors.
So it'd be like insight puzzles to teach insight.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much.